Welcome, everyone. I am Margot Crawford. I'm a professor of English here at University of Pennsylvania, and I'm the director of the Center for Africana Studies. And today's lecture is a part of the Center's Africa Lecture series. Please type any questions as you listen. After the lecture, we will have time for questions. I am delighted that our speaker today is Moses OCHONU. Moses OCHONU is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair in History and Professor of African History at Vanderbilt University. He is the author of Colonial Meltdown, Northern Nigeria in the Great Depression, published in 2009, Colonialism by Proxy, Hausa Imperial Agents and Middle Belt Consciousness in Nigeria, published in 2014, Africa in Fragments, Essays on Nigeria, Africa, and Global Africanity, published in 2014. And he is the editor of Entrepreneurship in Africa, a Historical Approach, and that was published in 2018. He has written a wide range of essays appearing in The Republic, Time Magazine, Global Post, African Arguments, and many other publications. He's working now on a book entitled Emirs in London, Subaltern Travel in Nigeria's Modernity. And today's lecture is based on this book in progress. Please join in welcoming Moses OCHONU for today's lecture.
Well, thank you so much, Margot, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Gail and Sean, for putting together, working through the logistics of this talk. And I'd like to thank my brother, Sheikh Babu. I'd like to thank the entire community, the Africana Studies Department, for this invitation. I'd like to share my screen, so let me go ahead and do that right away. Okay. Okay. So, so this talk is drawn from a larger project, a larger book project that I'm working on, as Margot said. This project is a monograph, a book project that is currently under contract at Indiana University Press. The geographical location of my talk, or just in terms of where the subjects and the people that I'll be speaking about come from, is Colonial, Northern Nigeria. And here's a map of that location. Although, of course, I'm discussing their travel to the United Kingdom, to Britain, but their natal region is Northern Nigeria. So really, what this talk and the larger project is about has to do with the convergence of two phenomena. One of those phenomena is a coming together of several developments. One, the rise of Romanized mass literacy, which was a program pursued by the colonial administration in Northern Nigeria, the British colonialists, for pragmatic reasons, for reasons of easier colonial administration. They wanted people in the region, as many people as possible, to become literate in the Roman script. Another development along these lines was the rise of vernacular publishing, mainly Hausa language publishing. And this encompassed the realms of newspaper, fiction, and non-fiction publishing. And all of these developments, I would argue, conduced to the emergence of a vibrant public sphere. And in this public sphere, you had writers and you had readers. Writers who wrote into this space and readers who read what they wrote. And the last part of this development was the rise of Hausa adventure literature. So once you had a publishing infrastructure in place, and you had an audience, and you had a public sphere where people wrote and read, the next thing was this development of adventure literature in the Hausa language, which I would argue connects to and was organically linked with earlier traditions of Hausa storytelling and Hausa production of fiction and stories about masculine conquest and adventure and triumph of the human spirit and exploration of distant lands and so on and so forth. The second development was the metropolitan travel by northern Nigerian emirs and aristocrats to Britain, and the subsequent production of post-travel narratives that were read by these Roman literate northern Nigerians in this new Romanized public sphere. I would like to go through some key events by way of introducing what I'm preoccupied with in this project. One of them was the establishment of the Literature Bureau in 1933. This bureau would later metamorphose into something much bigger. But the second development was the establishment of Gaskiya Tafi Kobo. This newspaper, the translation is "Truth is worth more than a penny." The newspaper was set up in 1939, primarily, as others have written, to serve as a propaganda outlet for the British government during World War II, during the breakout of the war. But it later quickly morphed and evolved into a platform that gave a voice, that gave an outlet for the new vernacular and English language intelligentsia in the region, in northern Nigeria, to vocalize their impressions of colonialism, to articulate their anxieties, their hopes, their demands, and to practice their craft of writing. The Literature Bureau that was established in 1933 became the mother bureaucracy where Gaskiya Tafi Kobo, the newspaper, was housed, where it was nurtured. In the beginning, before Gaskiya Tafi Kobo emerged, and before the Literature Bureau became what it became, when northern Nigerian emirs traveled to Britain, and there were a few who traveled before this period, before the 1930s, when they would travel to Britain, they would return and publish their accounts, mainly summaries of their travel experiences, in the northern Nigerian Colonial news sheet. This news sheet was read by clerks, teachers, workers, and other personnel in the colonial bureaucracy and in colonial private companies. In this period, the emirs would simply summarize their experiences, because the news sheet was just, as the name suggests, a news sheet. It wasn't a newspaper. So there was a lot of space constraint. And so they would basically be compelled to produce a concise, succinct, highly summarized version of what they did, what they saw, who they talked to, the highlights of their experience in Britain, and so on and so forth. The establishment of Gaskiya Corporation changed everything. This was a game changer in a lot of ways, because this corporation, funded by the Northern Nigerian colonial government, had a book and newspaper publishing arm, which was located in Zaria, and it was established in 1945 on the pre-existing model of the Literature Bureau. The Literature Bureau had been set up to acquire vernacular literature, to publish vernacular literatures, and it was able to do that before 1945. They were publishing several stories, fiction, non-fiction, and what they would do during that time was they would go to the secondary schools and solicit manuscripts from the students, and the students were very happy to write stories, to supply manuscripts that were later published. This was a big deal at the time. But Gaskiya Corporation it formalized the process, it professionalized the process of manuscript acquisition, but it also formalized the process of publishing. It was later renamed the Northern Nigerian Literature Bureau in 1953, and then it became the Northern Nigerian Publishing Company in 1959. Some of these traveling aristocrats published their metropolitan travel narratives and memoirs under the imprint of Gaskia Corporation and Norla. Notable examples are Abubakar Imam's Tafia Mabudin Ilimi, Travel is the Gateway to Knowledge, which was published in 1945. Muhammadu Ndaya Ko's Tafiyang Itunupe Ingila, Itunupe's Journey to England, which was published in 1955. Let me talk about the trips for a moment, just by way of also grounding this in the larger project and just putting out information that is central to understanding what is going on here. The first trip undertaken by an emir or aristocrat, as far as we know, to Britain was in 1921, and this was by Muhammad Dikko, the emir of Katsina. The last trip that I deal with in the project was undertaken in 1961 by the premier of northern Nigeria, the Sardauna Ahmadu Bello. The other thing that should be mentioned is that even though a lot of the emirs that traveled to Britain traveled there as individuals or in groups of 2 or 3, starting from 1944, the British Council and the Colonial Office decided to formalize the process and to include more aristocrats and emirs and some members of the intelligentsia, the Northern Nigerian intelligentsia. So they began to organize this group annual touring of Britain. The annual touring involved a stay in Britain of between 6 and 8 weeks. They would stay in Britain during this time, touring farms, touring institutions, bureaucratic institutions, the British Parliament, the House of Lords, schools were very much a part of this touring itinerary and routine, were very popular. Visits to schools. Factories were also popular destinations. And Buckingham Palace probably was probably the most popular tourist attraction and site. During the annual group tours, the tourists from Northern Nigeria will be entertained with lectures on topics as varied as British culture, British people, British agriculture, the British government, etc. Some of the topics are actually I find quite funny. When I was researching this in the archives, I would sometimes burst out laughing from some of the topics that the topics that the lectures dealt with. Things like British mannerisms, how the British are in their homes, how the British raise children, and so on and so forth. And I always wondered, did they conduct a focus group with the emirs before they arrived in Britain to gauge their interest, to ask them what kind of topics they were interested in? Who told them that these emirs would be interested in how the British eat food at home, how they raise their children? What kind of process determined what topics to focus on and what topics to exclude? So that's something that maybe we can talk about later. However, even with the advent of the group tours, the separate private tours continued. These tours continued to be organized for private people, for emirs and aristocrats. And these private trips had separate itineraries, different from the group tours. The emirs, in fact, had considerable leverage over these itineraries. Sometimes, many times, in fact, they selected where to visit. They determined what was included in the itinerary of tours, what they wanted to see. They told the colonial trip planners what they wanted to see, who they wanted to talk to, where they wanted to explore, the technologies that they were interested in, what they wanted to buy, and so on and so forth. And based on this information, an itinerary would be put together. An itinerary of tours and activities will be put together for them for the duration of their stay. They also told the colonial trip planners what kind of recreational activities they were interested in, what kind of sports they wanted to go see, and so on and so forth. So I want you to keep in mind the group tours being one track of this touring regimen, but also the private tours being a separate track. Some notable facts that I want you to also keep in mind. Wives of aristocratic native authority officials were selected for the tour for the first time in 1955 for the annual tours. So every year, these tours were going on, but it was only in 1955 that the colonial authorities decided to select women to be part of this tour. But the women went on their own with their own tour guides and with their own arrangements and everything. They didn't go with men. Prior to this time, prior to 1955, some northern Nigerian women did accompany their husbands on these trips. Dikko, Emir Muhammadu Dikko is a prominent example of this. He always traveled, or for most of his travels, he traveled with his wives. And when I say wives, I'm talking about multiple wives, 2 or 3. The award or the record for the most number of visits to Britain among these emirs and aristocrats belongs to Muhammadu Dikko, the emir of Katsina that I mentioned earlier. He visited Britain a total of 5 times, 1921, 1924, 1933, 1937, and his final visit to Britain was in 1939. During this last visit, he flew to Britain for the first time. His previous visits were by ship, were over water. On this trip, however, in 1939, he flew to Britain on Imperial Airways. And he also took advantage of this trip to get his eye checked out. I think he had surgery actually during this trip on his eye. 2 emirs, Muhammadu Ibrahim, who was the Ata of Ibira, who visited Britain in 1934, and Muhammadu Dikko, who visited Britain in 1921, that was his first visit, combined their visit to Britain with the performance of the Hajj, of the pilgrimage to the Hejaz. Metropolitan travel narratives. I would like to talk about this for a moment. When they returned, when the emirs and aristocrats returned from their trips, they gave lectures in Hausa and in English about their experiences in Britain. They would actually tour, several of them would tour, and this was quite popular at the time, and it happened around the Kaduna-Zaria axis, where they would tour, go to certain schools and go to certain town halls and hold these massive lectures in Hausa and in English over several days, talking to large audiences about what they experienced in Britain, who they saw, what they did, and so on and so forth. Metropolitan travel narratives resonated with a large audience of readers and listeners in northern Nigeria because my argument is that they resonated because the emirs and aristocrats, the travelers, they adapted the storytelling and literary techniques that were derived from Hausa adventure literature. I'll give a few examples. In their writings, in the Hausa language, they would always use dubu. Dubu means 1,000. Obviously, it's not supposed to be taken literally. When an emir would say, Naga motochi dubu at it in London, meaning he saw 1,000 cars on one street in London, that's not supposed to be taken literally, but it's a direct read-off from Hausa folkloric practices and techniques where exaggeration and strategic exaggeration is used as an effective literary device to communicate certain vivid images and pictures. Also, in many instances, when these emirs went to British farms and saw animals such as cows and birds and goats and sheep and so on and so forth, they always exaggerated the size of the cows. For instance, one emir said, you know, their cows are much bigger than the ones we have in northern Nigeria. And you have to put together 10 of our cows to actually come close to one of theirs, which obviously is not true. But such strategic exaggerations and metaphors are quite common in the narratives, in these travel narratives. The comparison of a plane to a bird, you know, how the plane flies, it's like a bird taking off. That's supposed to create in the minds of their audience this image of a bird and how it flies and flaps its wings and how it's, you know, the aerodynamic quality of the plane. They are comparing it to a bird, but it's all strategically calculated in this narrative practice to give an entry to their audience, as vivid an entry as possible to their audience into the experiences that they were having, into what they were seeing, without, I mean, they were trying to give them the next best thing to being an actual eyewitness. The Metropole, the United Kingdom, Britain, was a place of unusual social and recreational freedoms. It freed and released the emirs and aristocrats from the obligations, the rituals, and the routines of court and aristocratic life. What I mean by this is, and you can see this in the stories that they wrote, in the archives, but if you combine the two, because some of these things, they kept them away from their diaries and their own narratives. But if you look at what the colonial records actually say, it's amazing the kinds of freedoms that this travel to the metropole afforded them. And some of the emirs verbalized this new freedom because the routine of an emir in his court was so strict, was so regimented. An emir couldn't do certain things, couldn't talk in a certain way. Everything was choreographed, everything was scripted. But in the space of the metropole, they could throw away the script. They could become unscripted. You know, I'm actually friends with some emirs, and one of the stories that I was told in one of the palaces was that the emirs had to actually even eat certain kinds of foods so that they wouldn't have to go, because the emir, it wasn't in keeping with their prestige to go too often. So when they were sitting, when they're holding court in their palace, they wanted to be there to sit in one spot for hours without going. And they would be settling disputes, attending to visitors, and doing all kinds of things. So this trips was a vacation of sorts. It freed them from these routines, from these obligations, from these strictures. And it allowed them to engage in their pastimes, in their interests, to explore certain recreational interests that they had, and fantasies, even some of their recreational fantasies. In terms of how the itineraries and the programs came together, the emirs had considerable say in putting together the itinerary, as I alluded to earlier. The emirs, in the process of constructing an itinerary for them, they would make demands, they would express their preferences. They, for instance, would ask for prayer time, breaks, even during tours of certain facilities. They would always ask that the planners, the trip planners, include prayer time so that they could take breaks and pray. And they would always ask that certain provisions be made for a place where they could properly face Mecca during their prayer. They would ask for halal foods, the acts to be put in hotels that didn't serve pork in their restaurants. They told the trip planners that they didn't want to go to restaurants where bacon was served. In fact, on one occasion during the planning stage of one of the trips, the colonial bureaucrats who were planning this trip toyed with the idea of putting them up in a hotel that would allow them to cook their own meals, because I think the emirs were so adamant, the emir was so adamant that they didn't want to go near, they didn't want to be placed near bacon or pork. They didn't even want to smell these things that are forbidden in Islam. So the bureaucrats said, oh, how can we put them up in a hotel? Maybe we can buy them utensils and maybe they can prepare their own meals. But it didn't work out because they couldn't find a hotel that would allow that, that would allow the emirs or their servants to prepare meals for them. The other thing that I need to point out is that in several cases during the actual trips, during the actual touring in London and in other parts of Britain, the emirs would actually resist going to certain places that were already included in the tour program or plan, in the itinerary. They would say, no, we don't want to go see that. We've seen enough of that. We would rather do this. Other than that, we're no longer interested in this or that activity. Or, you know, could you let us rest? Or could you take us to see this instead of that? We want to see this machine, this factory, instead of going to this cinema to see this movie or to the theater to see this play. We appreciate that you've put it together, but could we be excused from this or that activity? And in fact, a funny story is that many times when they asked to be excused from some of the programs on the tour plan, they spent the time when they would be asked to be excused, they instead went shopping. So shopping was one of their favorite things to do. They would ask to be excused from certain activities, and they would use the time to shop for exotic and expensive luxury items. And I'll talk about that shortly. So shopping, and more shopping. They shopped a lot. They were consumers of empire. They were consumers of imperial commodity culture. They were consumers of imperial metropolitan modernity. They bought gifts, souvenirs, perfumes, and jewelry for wives and for female relatives. They shopped for textiles, exotic textiles. One emir even bought a royal stool and chair. They bought luxury cars, Morris, and so many other items. And these emirs were rich. They had their own money. They made money from different colonial income streams that they had. But they had ample funds. As a matter of fact, they shopped exclusively in luxury stores like Goldsmiths, like Harrods, and the rest of them. When I started researching this, one of the emirs who traveled to Britain went there with 33,000 pounds as pocket money. And apparently there's a website that allows you to convert money to their present day equivalent from the past. So I went to this website and I put in 33,000 pounds. How much is it in today's money? And it came out to more than 300,000 pounds. So this is how much this emir, just one emir, took with him to London, to Britain to shop. And so it doesn't surprise me that they were buying exotic cars, these expensive luxury items, textiles, jewelries, and so on and so forth. And this is Dikko, Emir Muhammadu Dikko, with his Morris car that he bought from Britain that was shipped to him in Nigeria. One of their favorite places to visit when they are in Britain was Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace was one of their favorite places to go to. Many of them were guests of the king. Many of them were also knighted by the king. The king gave them medals and awards and honors. People like Dikko, people like, I think, Abdullahi Bayero, several other emirs were knighted or got medals and awards at Buckingham Palace. And in their narratives, the emirs talked fondly of visiting, the palace and talking to the king and having the king grant them audience, the king shaking their hands, and the king, asking them about northern Nigeria, asking them about their domains, asking them about their hobbies and their interests. For many of them, this was a highlight of the trip, and the fact that they could see this great big king that presided over the British Empire, who had been so mystified and some just made into a myth of this all-powerful, all-conquering king who was so distant and so mythical. The fact that they could see him face to face and interact with him and talk to him and shake his hands, for them that was a big deal. And I think there was there was an element of demystification that occurred in those encounters at Buckingham Palace for these emirs and aristocrats. Everything was not all peachy or peaceful or rosy. They did have encounters with metropolitan racism, as is to be expected of this time, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 50s, even 60s. They frequently came up against what colonial records call this, they call them mobbing, press mobbing. The press followed them everywhere they went, even when they went shopping, when they went to museum, to plays, to see certain things, to tour certain farms, wherever they went. There was always a group of press people following them, getting in their way, just shouting questions at them, touching their robes, feeling their skin, doing those kinds of disrespectful, racist things to them. And quite frankly, the colonial records call this mobbing, but it's a euphemism. I prefer the term press harassment, or if you like, racist paparazzi, because that's what I think this was what was going on. These were racist paparazzi that followed them all around. The emirs in the metropolitan space, they became human curios. They became a spectacle for a lot of metropolitan British people, especially the press. And the press and the people would gaze at them in a way that pretty much said it all, that they were inferior, they were exotic, they were just so removed from British ideas of civilization and advancement, and people would ask all kinds of condescending questions. They would shout these questions at them. And on one occasion, one trip had to be postponed. They wanted to go out to the high-end shopping district of Liverpool, I believe it was Liverpool. But the planners, the colonial guys got word that a lot of press people had gathered at this location because they had gotten word that the emirs were going to show up at this location. And so the trip had to be aborted. The outing had to be aborted at that time. There was also the incident that happened at the Liverpool Hotel. The emirs were staying, some visiting emirs were staying at this hotel, and the hotel lacked basic facilities. Hotel was run down. I think they couldn't even get hot water, and it was just beneath them, and they complained and complained. And their colonial guides were exasperated. And finally, the truth comes out in the colonial report, because the colonial authorities and colonial guides were pleading with them, please bear with us, and then in the colonial confidential report, it was revealed that in fact, this was the only hotel that would let them in. Every other hotel that they approached would not let Black emirs from Africa, from northern Nigeria, stay in them. So they just couldn't find any hotel to take them. This hotel, this terrible, dilapidated hotel, was the only hotel, and it was on the outskirts of town that would allow them to stay. The other example of racism was the 1924 visit of Muhammadu Dikko to Britain as a guest of the British Colonial Office to witness the Empire exhibition celebration that was put up to celebrate the British Empire. But this was such a racist spectacle that he saw a recreation and an attempt to recreate the emir's palace, the Katsina, the typical northern Nigerian emir's palace. And the British government had shipped some Hausa people to Britain to build a pavilion, and they built this replica, they called it, of a Hausa village, and they shipped these people there to basically put them on display, put them on exhibition. And these people were there day and night for as long as the exhibition and the celebration lasted. They were there purportedly living as northern Nigerian Hausa village, Muslim villagers would live. And they had them weaving baskets, they had them cooking their meals in the traditional way. They had them doing all kinds of things, quote and unquote, traditional things that people did, purportedly did in a Hausa village. And Emir Dikko had to tour this display, had to tour this exhibition. It was a very awkward moment. It was a very awkward display. And another incident was that one emir actually was taken to a museum where he saw a display of himself as this exotic, as an example of an exotic African king. And his guides, his colonial, white British colonial guide told him, oh, that's you. And they were trying to make it into a joke. But I don't know if he found it funny, but I personally don't. But anyway, let's move on. So some of the arguments that I make in this project, I posit the emirs and these tourists, these travelers, as subaltern metropolitan travelers who translated imperial culture and translated imperial modernity into a Hausa language vernacular idiom. In bringing goods back, in bringing cultures back, in bringing stories about the metropole back, a lot of these tangible and intangible things that they were bringing back with them. They were translating them from English, from their metropolitan lingos and vocabularies, to a Hausa linguistic medium, so that their audience, their Hausa-speaking audience, would understand these cultures, would understand these goods, would understand these trends, and so on and so forth. So they were translated in that sense, not in the literal, narrow sense, but in the sense of translating this culture into a Hausa idiom to be understood in this region. I also posit and argue that the travelers were colonial explorers and reverse ethnographers. We are all too familiar with colonial narratives about Africa, colonial explorers or so-called explorers, travelers going to different parts of the continent and writing up their observations and their experiences and getting them published in Britain. I would argue that the travelers to Britain, these emirs and aristocrats, were engaging in the same kind of colonial exploration. In other words, they were shifting the gaze in the other direction. They were exploring Britain and they were returning, just like the colonial travelers, the British travelers had done in the past. They were returning to write up their experiences, to talk about metropolitan events and metropolitan cultures to their audience at home. And a very insightful part of this was that they were utilizing the same techniques. For some of us who are familiar with the writings of colonial explorers and travelers about African societies, they were utilizing the same techniques. The emirs utilized contrast, for instance, similitude, comparison, comparative frames, the same techniques, the same narrative and literary techniques that the colonial ethnographers and colonial travel writers used were pretty much the same types of techniques, of course, in a different linguistic medium in Hausa, but the techniques were quite the same. I want to argue also here that the curiosities of empire went both ways. Often our traditional analytical lens conditions us or socializes us to believe that it was only Europeans that were curious about African societies, that wanted to know more about Africans and how they lived, their cultures, their means of production, their flora and fauna. But I think in colonial relations, the colonized peoples, whether they were in Africa or elsewhere, they were just as curious as Europeans, as the Europeans that were colonizing them. They were just as curious as the British were about how the British lived in Britain, how they lived in their quote-unquote habitats, so to say, how they raised children, what kind of food they ate, what kind of plants they had, what kind of agriculture they practiced, their flora, their fauna, their animal, their wildlife. Africans were just as curious because knowing the metropole and knowing your colonizer had practical utilitarian value, I would argue, because it enabled you, I think, to navigate colonialism better. It enabled you to negotiate the colonial system, to avoid its excesses, and maybe even to take advantage of some of its loopholes. Because if you know your colonizer, if you know their predilections, if you know their habits, if you know the kind of society they grew up in, and what they value and what they don't value, I think you are better able to stay on their right side and not incur their wrath. So this knowledge about the colonial order, in this particular case, the British colonial order, and his society or her society had practical utilitarian value to northern Nigerian readers of these narratives, I would argue. The other point that I make is this idea of the weight of minutia. Minutia was very important in these colonial narratives, very important. The narrative, the travel narratives published in Gaskia, published in this newspaper, or published as memoirs, they had a lot of details. And these details, for me, in 2020, 2021, in the 21st century, sometimes, you know, in my 21st century sensibility, I find them somewhat boring. But, you know, after a while, you know, when I started researching this topic, I said to myself, why is this emir or this aristocrat going on and on and on about the quarry, about how this process of breaking stones and making pebbles and making quarry, this quarry factory that he visited, why is this is so boring? And other times I wonder, why is he busy describing in minute details the farm that he visited in this part of England or this part of Britain, all the details about the plants, the colors, the size of the plants, the animal and the dung and the processes. Why is he going to all of these details? And even the description of buildings, the minutia for me. So it came to me during one of my reflections, and as I was reading the stories in Gaskia and the ways in which these stories were being received, and how people were writing into Gaskia and asking questions about these stories and asking for more details. So it now occurred to me that this was a dialogic process. They weren't just writing in one direction. The readers themselves were asking for more details. And so to anticipate and to preempt this request, they were putting in as much detail as possible. Secondly, minutia and details was important in another respect because it validated their account. It gave them credibility in the eyes of their interlocutors and their readers and their listeners, because the idea was, look, if you said you've visited Britain, if you said you've visited the land of the white man, and you know the white man so well, and the ways of the white man, and how the white man practices agriculture, and so on and so forth, tell us more detail. So the more detail you have, the better. The more believable you are, the more credible you are, and so on and so forth. I also use this project to make the case, to make the point that colonialism was not always adversarial, was not always about binary oppositions and adversarial confrontations and relations. One of the favorite things that the emirs and the aristocrats did in London when they visited Britain was they would seek out their old pals, colonial friends, people who had served in the colonial service in Nigeria. Some of them had retired to Britain, some of them had been posted to other places. They would seek them out and they would have tea with them. They would visit them at their homes. They would even spend the night at their homes. They considered them friends and they would go out together and do stuff together. And then some of them would even volunteer. Some of these former British colonial officers would volunteer to be their guide, to be their tour guide, and would take them to see things. And to see. So there was, in this metropolitan space, you saw a reenactment of this unlikely imperial colonial affections, unlikely imperial relationships that developed in the crucible of colonization. And we can talk about this later. I actually have a story that I could tell later, a very funny, but also very tragic story along these lines to kind of buttress this point. But one thing that I didn't talk about earlier was that the emirs and the aristocrats set themselves up as experts among their audience. They set themselves up as experts on Britain, on metropolitan society. Much like, you turn on your TV today, you see experts discussing certain parts of the world that they've studied or been to. So that's the way that the emirs saw themselves. There's a whole growing literature in our field about imperial loyalism, about Africans or other colonized peoples who were fond of colonial systems and colonial symbols and the British monarchy, who were just drawn to or enamored with these symbols and objects of imperial might and greatness and prestige and so on and so forth. They were drawn to it. I mean, it's true that there were Africans who did that, but I would argue that these travelers were also critics. They admired the British monarchical system. They admired the British aristocracy. They said positive things about them, but they were also quite, I would argue that they were also quite critical in many respects. And we'll see some of the critics later, some of the criticisms later. They were not starry-eyed admirers of empire or of Britain or of imperial institutions and infrastructures or imperial technologies or modernity. But these people, these travelers appropriated, I would argue, they repurposed, they remade, they transformed colonial modernity and colonial goods. They applied them to new uses, they recalibrated them to serve new ends, and they basically demonstrated in the process alternative ways of being modern. So they took all of these things, they took all of these signs and significations and symbols and goods that they bought, a lot of them, and all of the things that they saw in Britain, and they reenacted them in ways that vernacularized them, in ways that transformed them, in ways that also made them compatible with their Muslim identity. So in doing so, I would argue that it showed that you could be Muslim and modern at the same time. You don't have to give up one. They could be Muslim and proudly so, but they could also be modern and tap into certain imperial modern goods or imperial signs of modernity, imperial modernity. They could tap into, they could consume imperial goods and so on and so forth. They also modeled to their subjects in northern Nigeria, regular Hausa Muslims, appropriate ways of engaging with and navigating colonial culture without running afoul of Islamic prohibitions and injunctions. They wanted to be the examples of how you can interact with colonial spaces. You can go to the Metropole, to Britain itself, right? And still come out as a Muslim, come out unscathed, as it were, come out unblemished. And still, you can go there and buy imperial goods and go to plays and go to see imperial sports and go do imperial things and enjoy yourself and have recreational engagements. And you can still be a Muslim and without violating any of the injunctions. So they were modeling that nuanced colonial interactional script, as it were, that way of that nuanced engagement with colonialism. Going to Britain also, I would argue, buttressed their claims to power, which was derived from imperial sources. They could use it to brag, basically, to say, look, I'm very close to the imperial authorities, I'm very close to the imperial system. So travel to Britain helped them to reinforce that claim that they were connected to the imperial sinews of power, to the imperial pipelines of power, that they could call upon this power to back them in any situation. Travel to Britain also, and the material that they brought back enabled them to translate imperial culture. I've already talked about that. In African history, in our field of African history, it is very common to celebrate the narratives and the experiences of regular Africans as purportedly authentic African colonial experiences and narrative, and to dismiss the narratives and experiences of elites, of the intelligentsia, of the aristocracy, aristocratic Africans, as somehow not inauthentic or not genuine, or rather compromised African voices or experiences or narratives. I'm arguing in the opposite direction. I'm arguing that this narrative that the emirs and aristocrats produced about imperial Britain should be studied, should be taken seriously. They should not be posed in binary opposition to the narratives of regular Africans under colonialism. Rather, they should be seen as complementary to those other narratives. I think there's room enough for all of these narratives. Metropolitan travel was a reinforcement of class hierarchy. There's no doubt about that. I should point out that the emirs and the aristocrats who were traveling to Britain had their critics. NEPU was a quasi-Marxist, quasi-socialist, leftist political tendency in northern Nigeria. And members of NEPU routinely criticized the emirs for betraying the poor people, the masses, the Talakawa, for wasting their resources, because some of their wealth that they used to finance these trips came from taxation on the masses, on the poor masses. And NEPU's members wrote op-eds in I think the West African Pilot and other newspapers criticizing the emirs for being vain and for being frivolous and for betraying the masses and wasting their resources. So there was definitely class tension, but I would argue that these class tensions were mitigated by the fact that regular northern Nigerian Muslims looked up to these emirs as symbols of religious authority. And so that mitigated the criticism. Another criticism came from the religious clerics, the Muslim clerics. One popular example was Sheikh Abubakar Gumi, who criticized the emirs for going to Britain to accept awards and knighthood from the king And he basically said this was a betrayal of their subjects and their Muslim faith, because that these knighthoods and these awards were named after Christian saints. Why would you accept an award, I mean, a knighthood named after a Christian saint? And he asked rhetorically, will the King of England come to northern Nigeria and accept an award named after one of the Muslim prophets? And so this was the object of his criticism. But let us look at some of the sample narratives as I try to round up here. The emirs criticized the architecture in the Metropole in the United Kingdom. They said that the architecture was bland, it didn't vary, it was unvarying. They said that life in the Metropole was too regimented and too fast-paced. Diko said, we laugh in Katsina, and then he criticized the English for having such a regimented life, for being controlled by machines. He said the English have too much to think about. Your amazing inventions have lengthened your powers, but shortened your chances of happiness. He goes on to criticize them, even the River Thames, that is a source of pride to British people. This was underwhelming for the emirs. They said, compared to the River Niger in northern Nigeria, the Thames, according to them, was an insignificant stream. We also see an incipient critique of the military-industrial complex and imperial war making. Diko, for instance, said, he criticized the British imperial armaments, the British the war industry, the military-industrial complex. They were taken to see warships, to see places where arms were being manufactured, and this is what he had to say. This was his reaction. Why do you prepare for war when everywhere I hear the world is at peace? With weapons like this, I never want war to come to my domain. This was an incipient critique of what we now recognize as a military-industrial complex. And I'm just going to show some photos now as I round up. You can just see the photos. This is Diko and his entourage in Hyde Park, London. This is Diko and his grandson at London's Hyde Park in 1933. This is, I think they were visiting the North Weald airfield in the UK in 1933. This is Emir Diko's grandchildren at Huntley's at the biscuit factory. This is the Emir Diko visiting the Lord Mayor of London, and he's seated there in the middle, the mayor to his right, and his entourage, members of his entourage. This picture shows the Sultan of Sokoto, the Emir of Kano, and the Emir of Gwandu inspecting a Royal Airways plane during their visit to Britain in 1934. This is the Sultan and the other two emirs again with Frederick Lugard visiting the London Zoological Garden in 1934. And this is a press clip from the British press coverage of the visit of one of the trips. This is another photo of the Emir of Katsina, Muhammad Diko, and his entourage. They were admiring a traffic light in Britain. This is Diko's wives during the 1933 trip. They were being taken on a sightseeing tour of London. And you can see this photographer is trying to take a photograph of them, trying to get them to pose for the photograph. And they are very shy because of course, the demands of Islamic modesty also prevents them from, taking off their veil and exposing their faces. So, you can see that's what's going on here. This is Diko and his grandson at the BBC, Diko's sons at the London Zoo. This is Diko at the zoo as well. This is more photographs from the airfield, their visit to the airfield. Let me see, one of the things that they like to do was, again, the Diko clan, they like to play polo, the polo sport when they visited Britain. And this is Nagogo, Diko's son, playing polo at Kettling Park in Britain. I'm going to show this. This is Katsina Emirate, the facade of the palace. When Diko returned from Britain in 1933, he caused the old facade to be torn down. This is the old palace facade, and to be rebuilt in this form because he wanted to recreate the front facade of Buckingham Palace. He wanted his palace to look like Buckingham Palace. And this is as close as they could get it to look like Buckingham Palace. This is the last photo I'm going to show. The pram was the most popular item in the emir's shopping cart. This is the item that most of them bought. And I don't know, I'm still trying to unravel why it was so popular with them, but I just wanted to show this as a conclusion to my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Moses OCHONU, for that truly, truly compelling lecture. The photographs alone, I think, are such an amazing archive. I greatly look forward to reading and teaching this book. And let me see, we do have a question from the audience. This question is about your reference to the press mobbing, or what you called the racist paparazzi. So the question is, what were the reactions of the emirs during such incidents?
Were mortified. They were horrified and mortified. You know, look for another more intense adjective. They were just besides themselves. They couldn't understand why they were attracting so much attention everywhere they went. Even when sometimes they got out of the hotel, sometimes you want to take fresh air, get fresh air. You know, just want to get out of the room. They couldn't do that. They would come out and the crowd would just gather instantly. Press, people, regular British folk would just gather, and they were just curious. They were, it's as if they were just these exotic curios on display. And so they felt very uncomfortable in many places that they went. Fortunately, sometimes they moved in quasi-official circles. So they had this protection. They would be moving in convoy. They moved in convoy, they were put in cars. And so they had that protection sometimes, but not always. Sometimes when they wanted to do things that they love to do, they wanted to just go out on their own and have fun. They couldn't, quite frankly, because, you know, this was 1930s Britain. So, yeah.
Yeah, so let me see if we have more questions, and we do indeed. Let's see, so since the emir's writings were essentially a work of translation, what work did the embellishments in their narratives do for the Hausa audiences? For example, why couldn't the cows in Britain be just a normal size? Why did they have to be twice as big as the ones in northern Nigeria? Was this a way of reinforcing the power of the empire?
I think, yeah, great question. Fantastic question. I think this was a way, because I think they were playing to their audience, as most literary people do, most writers do. And there was already this myth, all of these circulating myths about everything in Britain is bigger and better and more glorious than what we have here. There was, so of course that was not always true. Most of the time they were not true, but the myths, there were all kinds of circulating myths that gave imperial authorities and imperial countries this aura of power, of omniscience and omnipotence, right? And I think the writers, these emirs, were aware of that, and they wanted to satiate that. They wanted to satisfy that. But they were also, in some cases, genuinely impressed, and they were reaching for Hausa literary devices that even the readers would have known were not literal, were not to be taken literally, you know. But there was this community of intelligibility, literary intelligibility, that was at play here, that they were playing to, that they were, I don't want to use the word pandering, but they were drawing upon that. So there was this mutual intelligibility between the writers, the narrators, and the readers, I would argue.
So our final question, what is the memory of these trips in post-colonial Nigeria?
Some people remember these trips. Some emirs, some emirates still have a reputation based partly off of these trips. Sort of the Emirate of Katsina, for instance, has an elaborate sort of reputation in northern Nigeria. The lineage that reigns in Katsina today is descended from Dikko. It's the Dikko lineage that's still, and I think they've somehow even woven some of these imperial traditions and some of these metropolitan modernist signs and symbols into their own palace narratives, into the sense of who they are, into the way that they talk about the Katsina Emirate. Same thing with Kano to some extent. Some of them still they display the polo trophies that they won in Britain, what they saw, the gifts that they got, the medals. There's even the medal room in the Katsina Palace that houses all of the goods and souvenirs that they brought with them. So there's still there's an oral narrative that has been constructed around these trips. There's also the symbolic and tangible material culture, material artifacts that continue to attest to these connections. And I'll tell you a final story. The Emirate of Kano. Recently, there's a room in the palace of the Emir of Kano, Sorun Ingila. The translation is England Hall or England Pavilion or something. Still exists, and it's a source of pride to the Emirate. And they've renovated it. And when Prince Charles visited Kano several years ago, he was taken to that room. So these connections are still there. They're still part of this circulating idioms and narratives about the prestige of the Emirate system. Yeah.
So we do have more questions. Do we have time for one more? Do you mind answering one more?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
One more.
Yeah, I was worried about you guys, so I can take more questions, certainly.
Okay,
Yeah.
so final question. As you know, the Pan-African Congress met in England several times. Some of these occasions coincide with the years of the visits that are the subject of your talk. 1900, First Pan-African Congress, London, 1921, Second Pan-African Conference, 1923, the Third Pan-African Congress in London, Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester. I assume that their paths did not cross given the difference of their political stances on colonialism, monarchy, et cetera. But I'm curious whether you have information about this.
Yes, their paths, I think the questioner is right, is correct in assuming that their paths did not really cross, because the emirs and aristocrats moved in the quasi or semi-official circles. They were dignitaries of the British imperial state, guests of the king, guests of the colonial office, etc. And they were, for the most part, like I said, they moved around in convoys, and there were all sorts of protocols being observed, and they had tour guides and everything. But on one occasion, they were smack in the middle of this, some of these controversies in London during the 1924 visit of the Emir of Katsina. At that same time, Black students from Africa, from the Caribbean, from all over, who were in London, were demonstrating against racism, against the racism of the Empire exhibition, because the Empire exhibition was a racist spectacle. Let's not lose sight of that, right? And Black students studying in London, resident in London, Black people generally, they were protesting, demonstrating on the streets of London. And at the same time, the Emir of Katsina was a valued guest at this, and basically validated it. He was giving credibility and validating this exhibition with this awkward exhibition of his society and his palace and himself, ultimately, right? So it made for an awkward spectacle where in the colonial records, the colonial authorities feared that they might get wind of it. They might get wind of the emir, the visiting emirs might get wind of what was going on in terms of the tense racial atmosphere. And they worried that that might color or even tarnish the entire visit. But I think eventually they were able to shield him, the emir of Katsina, from all that was going on. And I published a paper recently in which I talked about, in the Journal of African History, in which I talked about this visit and how it coincided with this moment of intense racial tensions and protests in London, but at the same time, how the visiting emirs remained somewhat, at least partially, oblivious to this racial storm that was brewing at this time, simply because of their circles, the circles that they were moving in. Their circuit was just different. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Moses OCHONU. I'm holding on to your words. These travelers were also critics of colonial modernity. And when you refer to these alternative ways of being modern, I think clearly the entire focus on Nigerian modernity also allows us to think in a larger sense about all of the questions in terms of what does the modern mean in relation to Africa. Thank you once again. I greatly look forward to this forthcoming book. And let me thank all of you for joining us this evening. Please check out the center's website in order to get the details about our future events. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.